Welcome back, Bio3D Prep. We're going to start Unit 2, Human Body Systems, and what we're looking at is really the transfer of matter and energy within the human body. By the end of this unit, what you should be able to do in broad terms, general terms, is you should be able to describe or explain how the digestive and respiratory system exchange energy and matter with the external environment. You should be able to discuss the role of the circulatory system and defense systems in maintaining homeostasis. You should be able to discuss the role of the excretory system in maintaining homeostasis through the exchange of energy and matter with the outside environment. And you should be able to discuss the role of the motor system in relation to the function of other body systems. In terms of what you'll need to be reading, we're going to be turning to the textbook quite extensively now, and it's chapters 6 through 10 inclusively. So here we go, Human Body Systems. Here's the preparation. It's your textbook reading, pages 200 to 203. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify the levels of organization used to describe the human body. You should be able to use basic anatomy terms to describe the position of structures within the human body. You should be able to explain the general process of homeostasis. So when we look in the human body, one of the first things we should notice is that cells no longer look like those generalized animal cells that we were drawing in the last unit. Cells in the human body are heavily specialized. So there's trillions of cells in the human body, and they vary in both function and structure, or I guess another way to say it is their structure is indicative of their function. So if we take a look at these red blood cells, first thing you should notice is there's no nucleus, which is odd because we said that all animal cells have a nucleus. So what's going on there? Why don't they have a nucleus? You should also notice that their shape, in this slide, it's a little difficult to tell, but you can kind of see that there's a impression right here where it gets impressed on the cell on both sides. And what this is actually doing is it's increased surface area to increase their function. When we take a look at connective tissue, I don't know about you, but to me this looks like a spider web, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, this is connective tissue. It's there to join sets of other tissue together, so it makes sense that it's got these long strands, these long black strands that let them tangle together. You'll see these cells, the nuclei, the nucleus in each cell, very clear nucleus in that cell as well. When we look at muscle cells, much different shape than connective tissue. Muscle cells, you get these kind of striated banding patterns. If you take a look at these long black sections here, these are actually nuclei. And the neat thing about a muscle cell is each cell has more than one nucleus. So that's kind of odd as well. Here we have an animal, human being, with a whole bunch of specialized cells, each one very different from that generalized animal cell that we were looking at in the previous unit. Now, all of them have had at least at one point one nucleus. They all have ribosomes and mitochondria and all that kind of stuff. But because each one has a different function, their need for those different organelles is different. And what this division of labor does is it permits our body to function efficiently with these specialized cells. There's no way to get an organism as large as a human or an elephant or even an insect, really, without having cell specialization so that cells carry out specific functions. When we talk about the human body, we're going to be talking about it at different levels of organization, and this goes back to this whole idea of classification. Depending on what part of the human body we're looking at, we're going to talk about different aspects of it. For example, we can talk about tissues. Tissues are cells of similar shape and function. They do the same thing and they look the same. So if we even go back just one slide here, loose connective tissue, this is really a bunch of connective cells grouped together. We have muscle tissue here as well, a bunch of muscle cells grouped together. When we look at these red blood cells, there's actually two types of connective tissue here, a fluid one and a more solid one. Each type of tissue has a specific function. So cells of the same shape and function recognize each other, and that helps them stick together. So there's four primary types of tissue: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And I'll go over what those are on the next slide. The next level of organization is when these groups of different tissues get together to do a function. So groups of different tissues are called organs. A good example is the heart. The heart is made up of all four types of tissue. It has epithelial tissue, or a skin covering. It's not the same as the skin that's on the outside of your body, but it's still the same kind of cell. It lines the inside and the outside surface of the heart to protect it from infection. There's nervous tissue in the heart that connects it to your brain so that your brain can control when your heart beats. There's connective tissue. The blood that's pumping through it connects your heart to the rest of your body and to blood vessels. And then there's muscle tissue, which is probably the tissue we spend most of the time thinking about. That's the tissue that actually pumps blood through your heart. The next level of organization would be organ systems, and these are groups of organs that have a related function. So if we look at the circulatory system, it's made up of your heart, which is an organ, arteries, which are organs, and veins, which are organs. So organ systems are groups of organs, organs are groups of tissues, and tissues are groups of cells. So, and I'll just find a spot over here. So when we look at, we're going from smallest to largest, there's the cell. Cells make up tissues. Tissues make up organs. Organs make up organ systems. And organ systems make up individuals. So each one of us can be thought of as a collection of organ systems. When we look at tissue, there's four types. Epithelial, like we've already mentioned, it's a skin-like tissue. You can think about it as the outside surface of your skin, but there's more to it than that. Epithelial tissue covers and protects organs and lines your body cavities. So there's epithelial tissue attached to your intestines, helping to hold them in place and provide them with protection. There's connective tissue, which is there to make sure things don't move around too much. Without connective tissue, your skin would start to bunch up around your hands and feet. Around your hands and feet it would get really wrinkly. A lot of lupus. It's an autoimmune disease. And one of the things it can do is you end up destroying connective tissue. So what happens is your immune system identifies your connective tissue as being bad, which ends up, well, it attacks the connective tissue. And one of the things that will happen to people with lupus is that their skin will start to bunch up, especially around their wrists and their hands, and look all wrinkly because it's no longer being attached to the muscle tissue behind it. So the purpose of connective tissue is to keep things in the right place, structurally related to each other. When we go a little bit, another type of tissue is muscle tissue. Muscle tissue, we have a good idea what muscle tissue is. It's tissue that's used to move your body. So it contains things called contractile proteins, and these are responsible for your body movement. They're attached to bone, and they allow that, or sometimes they're attached to other tissues or other organs as well, changing their size when necessary. So muscle actually accounts to 40 to 50% of your body mass. Finally, there's nervous tissue. Much like epithelial tissue and connective tissue, it has a variety of different structures. It makes up your brain, your spinal cord, and all the nerves that connect both your brain and spinal cord to the rest of your body. And its purpose is to send information to and from your brain and coordinate activity. For organ systems, because we're classifying the body, and classification systems are for the most part a construct of humans, we make these systems to break, for example, a body down into individual bits that we can study. So there are many ways to classify organ systems, and things that kind of confuse our classification system a little bit are organ systems interact with each other. For example, when we talk about the circulatory system and the respiratory system, the two systems, we could say we need both for oxygen delivery. That oxygen delivery, since they're both used for the same thing, it's often grouped together as the cardiopulmonary system. So cardio for the heart, pulmonary for the lungs. Do we group them together? Do we look at them separately? It's up to the person who's talking about them. So also, sometimes organs are classified by anatomy or their position in the body as opposed to what they really do. So if you think about waste removal, both the kidneys and the intestines are responsible for getting waste out of our body, but most of the time they're talked about in separate systems. The intestines, because they're attached to the rest of your digestive system, are usually talked about when we talk about digestion. The kidneys, which are completely separate from the digestive system in terms of connections, they're connected to your circulatory system. They're usually talked about as a separate system on their own, as the excretory system, even though both systems excrete things from your body. When we talk about the human body, we're going to be looking at different parts of the human body inside the human body. We're going to look at the heart, cross-sections of the heart, kidneys. We're going to look at arterioles and other structures from different points of view. So, while I'm not going to test you specifically on these terms, it's a good idea to have an understanding of about what they mean. So, these are all anatomy terms, and they refer to a body that's in standard anatomical position. So this here is standard anatomical position. And what this is just a position in which you put a cadaver when you're describing the location of organs and tissues. Notice that the hands are facing up and turned out as opposed to curled in, which makes a big difference because that entire forearm is going to shift. The structures in it are going to shift if we roll our hand over the other way. So we'll just quickly go through some of the words. Anterior and posterior. Anterior means you're looking at the front. Posterior means you're going to be looking at the back of a structure, as if you're looking in through somebody's back. Superior, and if you can, I always tell this to my face-to-face students. I'm not sure how well it'll translate to over a recording, but if you imagine being superior to somebody, you're always looking down upon them. So superior is always viewed from above. If you're feeling inferior, you're kind of crouched down and looking up. So you're always looking up from below. Median and lateral. Median means you're viewing close to the midline. Lateral means you're viewing away from the midline. So if you imagine if there's a section on this body cut through, say here, if you're looking at it towards the arms, it's a lateral view. If you're looking at it towards the spine, then it's going to be a medial view. Proximal and distal have to do with where this section is in relation to an attachment point. These ones we aren't going to use very much, so if you want to just skip those two, that's fine. The mid-sagittal plane is this plane that cuts the body into two symmetrical halves, so it's the plane that's cutting this way through the body. It's the one that would split your nose right down the middle. The frontal plane is the one that divides the body into roughly two equal halves, front and back. So the frontal plane is this plane here. When you cut the body along this plane here, you're going to see your back half of your body, your bum, is going to be part of one section, and the front half of your body with your chest is going to be in the other half. Cross sections are often used to describe cuts along the transverse axis, or this last axis here. So this plane here is the transverse plane, and those are cross sections. They kind of give you an idea of how organs are located to each other as you move up and down the body. So every time you do a cross section, you're cutting the body in this direction. So these would all be cross sections up the leg. These would be cross sections across the arm, and so forth. So those are some basic anatomy terms. It doesn't help to get familiar with them, so that when we're looking at pictures, we can have an idea as to where these organs or where these tissues are in relation to a complete body. Some more anatomy terms. Often when we're talking about organs, most organs are located into one of three cavities or three groups. And they're organized kind of in terms of importance. If we take a look at the cranial cavity, this is almost solid bone with few openings. So it's a pretty tough case, which makes sense because it's covering your most important organ, your brain. So there's your cranial cavity. Often we can talk about, if we take a look here, this section here is your spinal cord. So sometimes this is included as part of your, not your cranial cavity, but sometimes it's counted as a cavity and sometimes it's not. So right here, this is your spinal cavity. The other major cavities are your thoracic cavity. And so your thoracic cavity is here. It's protected by ribs, and the diaphragm is an organ that sits right about here. This is where your diaphragm would be. And that is your thoracic cavity. Again, bone is a protective device, solid bone, almost entirely solid bone around your brain. Around your next most important organs, your heart and your lungs, we have ribs. Now they can't be solid because they have to increase and decrease in size for your lungs, but still, nice hard protection for your heart and lungs. Once we get below the diaphragm into this region here, this is your abdominal cavity. And you can't say that the organs there aren't important. They are important, but maybe not as important as the heart and lungs. This contains your pelvis, your spleen, stomach, all those other organs, and the major digestive organs are in your abdominal cavity. Sorry, I'll draw that line up to here. So here's your abdominal cavity in here. So those are three cavities in your body. If we were to label this picture, this would be a mid-sagittal section of the body. Or a mid-sagittal section of our cavities, the major cavities inside of our body that house our organs. Now we'll talk a little bit about homeostasis. Homeostasis is a process inside your body that your body is able to maintain this constant internal state despite fluctuating external conditions. So your body temperature inside remains around 37 degrees all the time, despite the fact that you might be going outside in temperatures as low as minus 40 up to plus 40 degrees Celsius. So there's 80 degrees of variation outside your body, but your body maintains a constant temperature. Non-living organisms, and even many living organisms, don't have this function. If you take an ice cube and you put it out somewhere where it's 40 degrees Celsius, it melts super fast. Vice versa, if you take steam or water, so even steam, which could be at 100 degrees Celsius when it starts, if you put that into a freezer, it will freeze quite quickly. Human body doesn't do that because we have this way of maintaining body temperature. There's certain mechanisms in our body that allow us to maintain consistency. Blood pH is almost always around 7.35. If it drops down to 7 or up to about 7.8, that's it, you're dead. So, blood pH of about 7.35, despite the fact that we can eat many really acidic foods, by the time those acidic foods get into our circulatory system, the pH is already back to 7.35. Our body maintains a blood sugar level of about 0.1%. When you eat a chocolate bar or something like that, blood sugar levels rise quite quickly. If that's a constant state, a consistently high blood sugar will lead to diabetes. So it's our body is only able to maintain these levels within a certain range. If we continually try to push these ranges out of the norm, then our body won't be able to cope with it. But generally speaking, our body is able to maintain a very constant internal state, despite what's happening outside of us. It requires constant monitoring and communication within the body most of the time, this is between your body, your brain, and then back out to your body. So something's happening to your body, that information is transmitted to your brain makes a decision about it, and then maintains the body's condition by reacting to the stimulus. So here's kind of a general structure for most homeostatic or a homeostasis mechanism. So there's some outside factor. So something's happened. So this is a factor. It's an environmental factor. And it could be an internal or a external factor. It creates some kind of stimulus, some kind of deviation from a set point. There's usually some kind of sensor. It could be sensory nerves. It could be, say, your stomach. Your stomach senses when it's empty. It sends that information back to a control center, which is usually the brain. Not always, but usually. That brain makes a decision. It says, all right, you're hungry. So let's stimulate salivary glands. Let's stimulate motion in your stomach to tell the rest of your body that you're hungry. So your body tells you you're hungry. The effector is hopefully you, and you're going to eat. When you do that, it changes the internal conditions. What used to be a deviation now returns to a set point. So it returns to a set point, and this is called negative feedback. So no longer feeling hungry, our brain senses this and tells us to stop eating, because we now feel full. And so that shuts down the response to that initial factor. Here's another example using body heat. So an example of a factor would be low body temperature if you're outside. The stimulus is this change of internal conditions. Your body temperature is dropping. The brain senses this, and it's also the control center. Another sensor for this could be there are actually sensory cells in your skin. It sends this information to the brain, and the brain sends a message out to effectors, which in this case are going to be your blood vessels and sweat glands. The response is your body temperature rises. So what's going to happen is blood vessels constrict. This prevents the heat from leaving your body. Sweat glands stop. So we don't want to sweat if we're cold, because if we sweat, we start releasing more heat. So sweat glands become inactive, blood vessels constrict. That's going to cause our body temperature to rise, which means we're no longer feeling cold. So this negative feedback is our body temperature returning to normal. This is sensed by our brain, and the loop is then shut down. So that's an example of how negative feedback influences homeostasis. So from this lecture, you should get the idea that the body can be described at different levels, a level of tissue, organ, or system, depending on what exactly we're studying. All organs are composed of those four main tissue types: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. There's a vocabulary that's been developed to describe the location of tissues, organs, and organ systems within the human body. And this is the human body when it's in anatomical position. And finally, this homeostasis idea is about the body's ability to self-regulate its internal environment or its internal conditions. And it's often achieved through this negative feedback loop, whereby the response to the stimulus counteracts itself. So there we go. Welcome to Unit 2, and we'll talk again in the next lecture.